All right. So the recording started, but obviously I can just cut out the beginning. All right. Welcome back to Shitty Untitled Anime Podcast. I am
A
not your
shitty
host.
titled anime podcast.
Yeah, you're right. The title is that, and it's a shitty title, so it's actually self-referential. It's like a spiral. Yeah, it
It's like
turns
a
back on
it's like
itself,
a
but it's
paradoxical
it's also a
spiral.
paradox. Yeah, yeah. I'm not your host. I'm Kate. My pronouns are she, her.
I'm John. My pronouns are he, him.
Today we're going to be talking about Paradox Spiral, the fifth movie of the
If
Cardinal
you haven't figured it
Kyoukai
out.
series. We just watched it together, not for the first time. I've seen it a couple times, probably like this is like my fifth time seeing it, maybe.
This is
Because
my
I've
second
rewatched,
time seeing
but
it.
but so the other movies I often rewatch on their own. This movie I have only ever watched when I'm watching the whole series because up until now I haven't really liked it very much. I mean, the first time I think I probably was like awed by how confusing it was, so I was like, oh, it's good. Um, but after that, I was like, yeah, I don't like it that much. My opinion has kind of changed though. This is something that I said like literally right when it ended. The first thing I said was that it's better than I remember.
I think your exact words were it's not as bad as I
Yeah,
thought it
it's not
was.
as bad as I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they mean the same thing, but yeah, the implication's a little different. It's I don't know how it compares with the first four. I mean, we'll save that for the end, but so I mean, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the movie in terms of its three parts because they're pretty different, and I think they vary somewhat in quality, and also just for the sake of being able to like refer to things without having to be on the level of individual scenes. But yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I didn't like it before is because it often, the movie takes a lot of risks, and very few of them really work, in my opinion. And that part of,
I think
my
work
judgment
is
of the
is
movie hasn't
less
changed.
fitting than very few of them are appropriate.
Yeah, like it doesn't
Like
land,
or
is what I
fitting.
mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Like they also don't work, but I think the issue is more that like
yeah.
it
Well,
just
so when I,
doesn't
when I say
gel.
like something doesn't work, I mean like holistically. So I think we're just
Okay.
different. We have different meanings
Yeah.
for that. Yeah, like what they do a lot of weird stuff intentionally, and very little of it really like lands. They don't really work in concert, and that part of my judgment of this movie hasn't really changed. I would say for sure like there's tons of stuff in there that I'm like you know, I think it's distracting. In particular, this movie is famous for being confusing, right? And I think most of that comes down to like a few decisions in like the second third of the movie. Like the way that they are really unclear about the number of times Kokuto visits Shiki's apartment and when, and what the sequence of events is regarding that, like when he gets the sword, when he first like tries her door and finds it locked, like when he first meets Enjo, like it's just needlessly confusing, and there's a there's a possibility that there's something going on there, but it really doesn't feel like it, and you know like overall, at least in my opinion, things like that you should be able to parse on your first watch, like it, you know and I
Yeah,
think
I come from the school of like if you need a rewatch in order to just parse things about the plot, you're in trouble.
yeah, I
But
100% agree with that. And I think like we were talking about this when we like were just fresh off the movie. A really good contrast is the way that they tell the scene with Toko's puppet out of order. I think that's perfect. Like it works fine. It's easy to parse because it's not too much information, and there are like clear visual cues that place you in the timeline. Right, like the presence of like Kokuto unconscious on the floor, the different cars that are parked, like those are enough to tell you like which iteration you're in, so that you figure it out by the time the whole thing by the time she shows up for the second time, you figure out what has happened. And I think that you know because they do basically the same thing. Like it's not just telling out of order. There's a specific thing that they do in this movie where they have shots that would normally be like just a connecting shot, and instead it's like they just use it to transition into another scene in a way that makes it feel like the scene hasn't changed. And I think that works really well with Toko because the scene in question is she walks up and Cornelius turns around and it's like, oh my god, and then it cuts back to her dropping her suitcase and the puppet coming out. And it never, I guess it never actually shows the first time she came in, right? Like from the first iteration, the first shot you see of it is her dropping the suitcase and the puppet comes out, right? And so when you're first watching it, you don't realize that the scene has changed, right? Like you can sense something's off because it's like he says you should be dead, and it's like, okay, so clearly we're coming into this in the middle of the action, um, right? But you don't realize that that was where the cut was until later when you see the exact same shot again of him turning around and being surprised, and then the scene continues normally. I think that works. Doing it that way, like it's parsable on your first watch, and it serves a purpose. Like it works really well for like the whole like gimmick of what's going on and what Toko's like not power, right, but like what her thing is. Like it gets it across pretty well because, well, I don't think I really have to go into it too much, but the idea is like she has two lives and like everyone's surprised about that, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember initially thinking that the way they did it with, setting it up and then basically going back and going from the first time she walks in, um, like I remember thinking initially on my first watch that that was unnecessary, but I mean, I think it works. And understanding the gimmick a little better, it it's definitely less unnecessary. But I
Really,
mean, yeah,
I mean, those are
I
those
don't
are
know.
kind of
I'm
reserved.
still kind of,
You're on the fence about it.
yeah. I mean, I said right when we finished it, like, this is only my second watch. Like, I don't have that much in depth to say about it. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like it. Because
oh
I
yeah. I'm
think
not saying I don't.
a lot of the appeal of this series is like the cool moments. Like as much as it's pitched as like a philosophical thriller, like, just people having cool powers is cool, right? And I think as
Well,
like as much as you
I'm
can do
talking more
from
about the
every angle to drive
presentation.
home the
Like, the
impact.
presentation feels kind of
Yeah, but I
pretentious isn't
think
the right word,
doing
but
the presentation this way, I think really does help to hammer home the impact of like her reveal, right? So like I
yeah,
don't know.
that's true.
I like it there. But we can talk about something we do agree on, which is they do the same thing with shots
I don't
of
even
opening
necessarily
doors.
disagree, but
Uh, yeah, I mean, fair enough. But they do the same thing in the second third of the movie with shots of opening doors where, you know, Kokuto will reach his hand out to open a door, and then, it'll be a different shot of
it's
opening a
it's
door
all
and
over
going
the
in
movie.
somewhere.
It's not just in Act 3.
No, 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 yeah, I mean, the overall, like, the shots of people reaching for doors is
Oh,
everywhere.
you're talking about, okay, now I understand what
But
you're
I
talking
mean
about.
specifically when you take a shot where it's like there's a progression of shots that feel like they should just be within the scene, but in there it just changes scenes. They
Yeah,
do that a lot with the door shots, specifically in the second
in
act.
Act 3. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wait, Act Three, is that not the second third of the movie where it's
Act 2, Act 2.
where
My
yeah
bad,
where
my bad.
it's Kokuto's point of view and it's him like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
going to her apartment
Sorry.
multiple times? Yeah, yeah. So
I was like
I
second, third. That's third, third.
yeah, I mean, if I were doing a more serious analysis, I
There
would
are
definitely
only
go
two
through and find
thirds
the
in
actual
the
shots
whole.
that I'm talking about. Unfortunately, the one with Toko is the only one that I like specifically remember what they did. But they have other shots where it's just really confusing. And unlike with Toko, I can't really see the straightforward reason why it has to be confusing. Which doesn't mean there's no reason, and it doesn't mean that not every reason like for you know presentation being a certain way has to be straightforward necessarily. Like I tend to like comprehensibility more than I like subtlety, but you know, I don't think that it's too subtle or that it's like too hard to understand. It really does seem like there's kind of no reason for how confusing it is. Like the
Yeah.
only like explanation I can come up with is the obvious one, which is like, oh, it's meta commentary on like, you know, like you're confused as the viewer because like the people involved in the story are also confused. Like the story is confusing you in the way that the apartment building is designed to confuse its residents, and it's like,
It. I mean,
okay,
what I
like
would say to that is that, like, the story goes way above and beyond, or like the presentation of the story goes way above and beyond in confusing the audience, and it doesn't need to.
yeah, like I think that the point is very much driven home, even just with like, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say that it's totally unnecessary because I think a little of it would have been fine, right? But they go all out with it, man. It's incredible. Like, yeah, it's a little too much. I think if you need to watch like a YouTube video that explains the timeline, like again, you got to work on your movie being comprehensible on a like one watch through. Um,
Yeah, or like even if you need two or three rewatches to be able to just parse like
yeah, yeah. Well, I
the
mean,
temporal progression of the plot, like
mhm.
like maybe hey, like maybe everyone else out there is like, obviously they're not because everyone's complaining on the internet, but like maybe everyone
Well,
else
they
out
don't
there is
complain. They like it for that.
well, yeah, they're talking about it. Yeah, like bringing it up. Um, but maybe everyone else like parses it for like really well, and then it's the kind of the other stuff that gets people. But
Yeah, there's a difference between like things that you pick up on a rewatch that are like added depth and value and like just not being able to understand it at all on the first watch.
yeah,
Like, yeah. I think people often mistake the former for the latter, but in any case, one
like
like
Tenet.
well, yeah, like Tenet is good though.
That's what I'm saying. Tenet is like a good example of
Oh, I
that
see.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, like one of the ways that I think it's totally fine to tell like this story out of order is the way that they split the perspectives, where they tell like the complete story from complete leading up to the climax from Shiki's perspective, and then the exact same like timeline, like from beginning to end from Kokuto's perspective, and then they go into the climax where they have like in a certain sense both perspectives, but they're like staggered anyway. So, um, but yeah, like I guess the climax is actually from more of an omniscient perspective because you also get like Araya having his dream and stuff.
Yeah. Not
But
omniscient in a temporally linear sense, though.
oh yeah, I mean never.
What?
Yeah, I mean I actually don't mind at all how the movie is
Oh, I don't
structured
mind it
though,
either.
like on a macroscopic
Well,
level. Like I definitely I can
yeah,
appreciate it. Um,
for the climax, I agree. I think the first two acts I think it's needless, but
to have the first two acts split like that.
or
I don't.
no,
I think
like
it
I
almost
think
makes
it's
it easier to
needless.
understand.
Well, no, I agree. I'm saying I think it's needless for the first two acts to be as confusing as they are individually.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I don't think the first act is that bad. I think it's mostly the second one. Because the first
Yeah,
act,
that's
it's
fair.
only
That's
confusing
fair.
because you don't have context, but the temporality of
Yeah,
it is very
yeah,
straightforward. Like
yeah. I mean, this was my second
Shiki like
rewatch, and I
appears to know
barely
things
remember
that she
anything from
shouldn't
the start
know,
of the movie. Yeah.
and so you find yourself asking questions that are like, oh man, like how does she know all this stuff about like the place where he lives? But I honestly think that's fine, like because they get
Oh
answered,
yeah,
right?
no,
Like
I
it's
thought it was
that's
fun.
the whole
Yeah, like
point.
those things I
Um,
was filling in, like that I
yeah,
was cool
yeah.
with.
So yeah, like I think the first act is absolutely fine in terms of comprehensibility. The issues that I take with the first act is just like the presentation of it and the tone, especially like the repeated clock shots and the montages. I don't think they really work. Like
Yeah, I guess
they feel like kind of a waste of time to
what I'm
me.
thinking of with Act One is like just Enjo like sitting at the like sitting on the bench like outside in the plaza, and then like they just do the clock thing like 10 times, and then like the ticking in the
Yeah, like
background, and like
and
that's the kind of stuff that I think is needless.
yeah, and I think, I mean, not that we have
Like
listeners, but an
did we
imagined
need?
listener, I think, might object that, like, well, like you need to convey the fact that, like, he's like trying, waiting for people to discover his family's bodies, and like,
But
time
they
is passing, and
conveyed
he's
it in
getting
such a
more and more
roundabout
like
and bloated
anxious about
way.
it. Yeah, like it's not even that it's roundabout. It's just that they take a ton of time to do very little.
I guess that's what
Um,
I mean by roundabout.
yeah, yeah, like
Like they're
you
just
know,
going around. They're not going anywhere. They're not like making significant progress, but they're just taking up time going around and around.
oh,
Which
it's like a spiral.
spiral. um, yeah, like I'm mostly like I think of like when he's like watching the screen and like before the first time he's watching the news, it's like it's like the person running just like quap, and then he's like, oh, and then he imagines himself in that, and it's like okay, like
Wow, what a
Is it
connection.
that
He ran
important that he
track.
ran track? Like,
Yeah.
like you can't just say it later in the movie? Like, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
like
on the one
was there
hand,
any
like,
was there anybody who was watching the first chase being like, nah, I don't believe that this dude can run. Like, I don't believe like no, and then like, 10 minutes or 5 10 minutes later, you show him and it's like he sees himself running and it's like, oh, I guess he did track. Never mind, I'm okay with it. It's just like it feels pointless. Like
yeah,
no one asked for
like,
that.
I think, personally, the issue that I take with it, I don't actually mind them spending time on something like that. As much as I don't think that particular instance, like, works. I mean, I use the word works a lot, but, like, as much as I don't think that
Functions.
particular cut is, like, impactful, like, it doesn't, it feels really, like, weird and out of place, like a lot of the stuff in the first act does. Like, the tone is just not consistent, and, like, it doesn't have the feeling of a Karano Kyokai movie. Stuff doesn't flow that well. So, like, I think that's mostly my problem with a shot like that. But I honestly, of all the shots, and all the ways that they spend time in the first act, I absolutely don't mind that. Like, connections like that, even if they're really trivial, like, they do add a certain richness to the story that, like, I don't mind. I think, like, if you're, like, on the chopping block and you're like, look, we gotta get rid of something, and that's, like, the only thing left, like, yeah, I mean, you can do without it. But there's lots of other stuff. Like, the montages are, like, very long. All the clock shots are like, is this really necessary?
I didn't mind the montages. Like I agree that they're long. I didn't mind them as much because they feel like they're
Mm,
doing something.
I guess.
Um, the track thing feels almost orphaned. Like it feels like it might have been like a detail in the plot, and then they took that
Yeah.
detail out.
Well, the
Like,
one thing
and
we
then
can agree on is
there's
you could
just these
absolutely
like
tighten up
orphan
the first
setup.
act.
Yeah, I mean you can
Like,
tighten up every
but I,
act.
well, no, but I think that, like,
It's a
what I mean is,
2 hour
like, that's
movie.
the main problem with it. Like, the others, there's
Okay,
more to say.
fair,
I think
fair.
the first act is, like, relatively straightforward, and all that I can really say is, like, it could use a more consistent tone and a bit of tightening up from a pacing perspective. But all things considered, like, it's kind of unremarkable. The second act is, like, I think what gives the movie its reputation, because it's kind of all over the place. Well,
Yeah.
kind of, it's extremely all over the place. Yeah, like, the story is, like, relatively straightforward, and I think you know, if they had told it in a straightforward way, they may end up with just, like, two first acts where it's like the whole thing just feels like it's plodding along. If they confuse you a bit, then, like, you get, I don't know, I guess you just you feel more engaged because you're trying to figure out what's
Yeah.
going on. But I think the solution is just to make it shorter, right? Like,
Yeah,
so
like
that
a big
it
part of
doesn't
the
drag on.
second act being confusing is like the monologuing and just like not great exposition.
Yeah, like, yeah, another thing that I was saying earlier is, like, I often feel that the monologuing in this series is either, like, exposition dump or, like, saying stuff to sound cool, and it's usually not both. I wish I had a good example. I mean, when's it both? Mirai Fukuin, that's when it's both. When it's both, it's really good. But usually they're doing
Which
one
I
or the other, and it feels like a big waste of time. Because like, when you monologue just to say stuff that sounds cool but doesn't have much substance, like, people pick up on it. Like, I prefer that over the alternative because, like, at least it sounds cool. Like, I do care kind of more about, like, at least in a series like this, I do care more about, like, you know the experience, the atmosphere, like, the tone. I think that matters a lot for something like this. So, if you have to say something, maybe say it in a way that's cool. But it's better to have some substance to it, to have it be performing some kind of function in addition. But more often than not, what it is just advancing the plot in a way that's not cool. Uh, kind of sucks. And yeah, the second act is
and
plagued by that. Like, there's lots of
well, a
conversations with
lot of it is
Toko.
trying to advance the plot, but it's like kind of rehashing the same stuff that we've been talking
Yeah, well, the thing
monologuing
is,
about
they're,
for
like,
the last
tripping over
little
their
while.
own feet, where they've made it so
Yeah.
convoluted that now they have Toko saying the same thing, like, three different times, and it's like, okay, I mean, you could just not, like, it needs tightening up in a different sense. Like, I don't even necessarily like the way that they cut back and forth.
No,
So
it's
the scene
actually
at the
really well
exposition.
made. It's actually super well made because they knew that they would just like completely lose people after the second act, so they made Toko explain it 3 times, the same thing 3 times in different ways throughout the climax, so
You're
that you
right. You're
couldn't
right.
miss it.
Well, she doesn't do that much explaining in the climax. It's mostly in the exposition,
Well,
or in the, well, yeah, the it's literally called the
it's like the
exposition
start and
scene,
the
John.
end.
How did I miss this? How did I miss this? It's they're doing exposition at
Oh,
an exposition. It's like a spiral paradox, dude. Oh! But yeah, like the exposition scene, I actually don't mind. Like I like the way that they're cutting back and forth. I think the way that it
I was
is
thinking
presented is
mostly
actually
of
fine.
like when
I don't
she's
like
like
what she actually is
talking
saying
to
during the
Soden
scene,
at the
though.
end. Yeah,
Oh, when she's talking to Soren at the end, Soren, you can just cut that. Like,
yeah, I agree.
um, like the whole like Soren, like what do you wish for? I guess is the way to translate that.
Soden,
And he's
where
like,
where do you wish it for?
yeah.
Wherefore dost thou wish?
Well,
Soren.
that would be why. Um,
Shh.
yeah, like.
Um,
I don't
yeah.
necessarily mind
Also,
it because, like, asking the same questions and he answers three different times. Like, again, like that's very much on like the rule of cool level where it's like, okay, you can have your fun.
and that's just Nasu being Nasu almost.
Yeah, yeah, right. Like, all right. As long as it's not like
I can
replacing
forgive it
something else.
certainly.
Like again, if we're on the chopping block, like sure, but also it's fine.
Yeah. The other thing is like how he just has um, like Nasu just explains like, oh, Ryogi, that's the thing inside
Oh yeah,
the
inside the
the
taiji.
tai the taiji, yeah.
Is it
Um,
taiji or
I forget exactly, or like taijutsu maybe. Um, and then at the end it's like, oh, like Arayashiki is like the very thing that you named after
taijutsu?
you.
I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I got it right. Um, but or according to that. But yeah, like it's typical light
Arayashiki.
novel bullshit. Yeah,
Yeah, like I
where it's just like
remember.
explain the thing that you came up with that you think's really cool. Like I have to explain this to people, or they won't realize how cool it is, and they
Yeah, I mean,
won't
it
realize
seems really
how smart
cool
of a writer I am.
when you set up the two characters as having those names, and then afterward you're like, see, it
And then you're
is
like,
this
and then you
concept. But
just
when
like
you think about
explain it.
how it was made,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, so you took a word and you split it into its component parts, and then made characters that were named after it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, eh, yeah, I think that part is kind of lame. I think a lot of like the okay, let's put off talking about the third part. I do want to keep talking about the exposition scene. Like,
Yeah. Sorry.
um, what's another word for an exposition? Like an art show? Because it's so confusing to call it exposition when it's also the scene where she does an exposition dump.
Um, convention? I don't know.
Whatever. We'll just call it the exposition because
Exhibition.
it's fitting. Exhibition,
Exhibition.
maybe? Yeah, yeah, exhibition.
Yeah,
Um,
because she called it like the art exhibition, I
yeah,
believe.
yeah, yeah, it's her
In the
exposition. Oh, it's her exhibition. I was mixing up the words. That's embarrassing. But yeah, like I actually don't mind the way that they
I mean,
cut between that scene because
exposition, exhibition.
what they do is like they have her talking to Kokuto and then
That's a
her
tongue
talking
twister right
to
there.
Cornelia Saba, and like I actually like the way that they've set it up. I just think that they like say things too many times. Like they set themselves up to do something where they like not only showed what had happened in a way that was like a little bit disjointed but comprehensible, and like showed like just like the denotative level of like the plot where it's like they went here and did this, right? But then also get in some like conversation where like they've done this a couple times where it's like instead of having Toko monologue, they like cut between two conversations where like taken together it like becomes exposition even though her lines are like believable in each conversation. I really like when they do that when it works because it's like
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like straight up exposition because it's like each time she's saying something that's like sensible within her conversation, and then like the way that they string it together it becomes exposition. The problem is it does they don't do that. They just have her doing exposition, and then the conversations are kind of built around that. And yet because they've split it up she repeats herself a bunch of times, so they're setting themselves up to do it really well, and then it ends up being bad, sadly.
It's falling
So
flat
that's
on
what I
its
mean when I
face.
say I don't mind it that much, even though I hate how much she repeats herself. Like I can see like there's potential there. I just wish it was capitalized on. Um, that's mostly what I can remember for the second act. And that's like, the main. Yeah, so the climax. My personal thoughts are that it's actually quite good up until a certain point. And then it's just kind of doesn't come back.
Yeah, are we gonna talk about the Shiki Shiki record or Shiki record in the root
Yeah,
or
we
the
can.
organ?
I was giving you some space to recall where we were when I said let's put this off. Because if we had a specific thing that we were saying, we
No,
can
I
return to
didn't
that
really.
first.
I didn't.
Um, yeah. So I'm just trying to remember what we were talking about to make sure that I'm not just abandoning it. But yeah, like basically, like I think that the way the climax is, it actually it works quite well to build up to like Shiki killing Araya. And the music builds up pretty well too. Like the whole thing, like it's very exciting. Like they bring back the elevator shot, but like now it's fast. Like I'm totally with it, and like the tension is built up very well. Right up until they play the scenes of Shiki dreaming in the root, and it's like okay, you just like diffused everything for no reason. Like I I could permit like a little bit less long, like if they had like one or two choice scenes that they really wanted to repeat for impact,
Just
like sure.
drags
But
on
yeah, it's really
and
long.
on.
It's like really long, and the tension fizzles out in the meantime while that's happening, which is it's sad.
Fizzles feels softer, but I guess that's probably accurate.
Yeah, like it.
To me,
Yeah,
it's almost like the tension gets cut. Um,
well, because at least because of the music, I thought it would end after like one scene, and so the tension was still kind of there. And then when I
for
realized
me,
how long it was
because
going
it
to go
kept
on,
going and the music kept going, the tension just died right there.
yeah,
Like,
exactly. Like, well, just because it goes on for so long, that the tension dies basically as soon as the viewer is like, oh, this is just continuing. Um,
yeah, like, oh, this isn't just like a quick, like,
yeah,
you know,
and
they're like
like,
actually trying to do a whole information dump. And like, I see that
yeah,
scene as like them almost trying to like make it less confusing.
like
Like,
there's a couple
but
things that they're doing
I
there,
don't
right?
know.
Like on the one hand, like it's callbacks to important scenes that are
Yeah,
like thematically relevant to what's happening right now. It's like okay, sure, I approve. On it's also kind of like an exposition, not exposition, but it's like a reordering where they're like going back through the events of the movie, um, not in order, but kind of straightening things up, right? Which is like okay, not now, but I kind of respect it if you were doing it at a different time. The other thing that they're doing is they're showing new scenes. They show scenes where previously it was muted in the montage,
yeah.
but now you can hear what they're saying, and that is just like man, this is indulgent. Like again, I respect it. Like if this were a thematically relevant scene where the dialogue is super crucial, where it like
I don't
casts
know
a
how
new
much
light
I
on
respect it,
things,
but
and well, okay, but like so like
sorry,
hypothetically,
keep
right?
going.
If it were a thematically important scene where the dialogue was like relevant in this moment, and it was also like short and sweet, and that was all that they were doing with it,
Well, okay.
then it would be impactful, right? But
There's a
it's not
lot of
that.
ifs for
They're
me.
they're doing too many things with it. Yeah, exactly. But what I'm trying to say is like any of the things that
I
they're
know what you're
doing
trying to say.
individually
Sorry.
would probably be like forgivable, acceptable, or even maybe good. But as it is, they're doing so many different things that the tension they let the tension just drop to the floor, right? Um, so sadly, uh, and the thing is like it's possible that it's like they just have that one mistake and then afterward the tension picks back up. But the fight is kind of silly. Um,
Kinda.
the yeah like I mean this is UFO table, right? Like this is kind of their journey. They've gotten way
2008
better. Like
UFO
nowadays
table.
this is not the case, but it used to be that UFO table when they did fight
2009
scenes.
maybe.
Yeah, like I mean, well, because this was like the only thing UFO table. This was their like breakout series, right? So
Yeah.
this was like their first like big animated series that wasn't claymation. Um, so yeah, like this is how it was for a while, where their fight scenes, the camera movement was a little bad. There was a lot of shake that didn't need to be there. The choreography wasn't quite it. Like, and this is I think one of the most glaring examples. It's just like it kills it. Like you want to see a cool fight, and then it's just like, hey, you're spinning now. If you're super invested, I'm sure you can forgive it and just be like, oh, it's cool. Wow, I'm riding a roller coaster. It's amazing. But, you know, when you actually want to see and like I wanted like cool fight choreography. I wanted to see something cool, and instead what I got was a spinning screen. Yeah.
Spirals.
You're right. How did I not see it? Ah! Ah! Yeah, and not only that, but after the fight, or like I guess the end of the fight, where like he crushes the building and Shiki jumps out and lands on him. It just feels dumb, man. Like I don't know. Like
Yeah.
it's not an interesting way because like they had multiple times where it's like she can see his lines and she cuts them, but he doesn't die, and it's like why like that's an opportunity for like doing an interesting fight choreography where you're like, all right, like here's the gimmick, like she can't approach things the way that she normally does. What does she do? But the solution is just fall on him with a sword in his chest, I guess. Like I don't know, it's
Yeah.
kind of dumb. And I mean, I guess she didn't cut
Now
his
that she has
lines,
the
right?
sword.
Like I think she didn't
Yeah,
like
she did
actually.
not cut his lines.
Yeah, like
That's that. I mean, she never
right, like
saw lines.
he
So
died
maybe like
purely of his own like like he didn't prepare a spare body, and he just died from like the fall and being stabbed.
the way I interpreted was it had to do with like it's an old sword, like so it can cut
Yeah, and maybe
barriers a
also
lot
the sword.
easier
Yeah,
or
it
whatever.
cut his
And
barriers. Yeah.
yeah,
Which like I like the whole thing with the sword. I like it's fine. It's Nasu stuff. It's wiki stuff. Like okay, sure, like it's a little bit like over the top, hammy, if you will. But also it's fine because it's cool. Like sure.
and also it's the fifth movie. Like
Yeah.
it would be a lot worse if you were like pulling out all this wiki shit like in the first movie, like when you're trying
Yeah.
to introduce people to the world and the story and the characters. But it's movie five. If you're here, you're already invested in kind of the lore, so piling on lore is fine. It's maybe not what I want
Yeah.
because
Well,
I'm
and
not
especially
super
because
invested
like
in
the,
it.
the
But
sword stuff is pretty unintrusive, right? Like
oh yeah, yeah,
if
yeah. I'm
anything,
not
like the way
talking
that they go about it
specifically
is
about the
great
sword
because
as
it's
much as
like
I am
she doesn't like
everything,
it's not like
like the
Toko just
root
looks at the
origin
sword and
and
is
all
like
that.
that's a pretty wild sword you got there, like that would cut any barrier. Hopefully we don't run into a situation where you need to cut barriers. It's not like that. It's like she says like, oh,
Yeah.
don't take it out here. Like it's an offhand thing that is believable in context that also just serves to like let you know why
Well, she
the
also
thing
said,
works.
yeah, she explains why, but yeah,
I mean, yeah, in like one clause. She's like, that's an
exactly.
old sword.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah,
take
yeah,
it out here. Yeah, like,
okay.
yeah, it's well done. It's rather unintrusive, so that's why I like it. But yeah,
Don't
as
disagree.
far as the fight goes, I mean, maybe if the choreography was better, I would be fine with it. But yeah, like the way that it ends, kind of silly. Like the whole everything leading up to that. The fact that he says he's gonna collapse the building and then like the building is shown to collapse and then it's still standing is like okay, like yeah. I mean, if I was especially charitable, I can simply say like, oh, okay, I guess the inside just collapsed. But like that's not how buildings work, dude. Are you really gonna tell me
But
that nothing in the
it's not
interior
a
was load
building.
bearing?
Okay,
Like,
it's
oh yeah,
not a
it's his
building.
body. It's his body.
It's
You're
his
right.
body. Come on.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was built as a building before he like made it his workshop and body. So well,
Yeah.
I don't know, man. But yeah,
Also,
like
like it feels murky. Maybe I'm just reading it wrong. It feels murky to me, like what Toko actually knows, considering that she helped build it. Um,
I think she just knows everything. I think she just because she said like, oh,
okay,
I saw this coming when I chose to get
okay.
involved with Yogi Shiki.
So
Like,
she's just being deliberately okay.
yeah, I mean,
That
I
makes
wouldn't
more
say
sense.
deliberately obtuse, but she's like, all
Well,
right,
not
well,
obtuse, but
yeah,
she's
like,
deliberately hiding information from them, not necessarily from the audience.
yeah, like I think
Because
I think I think what it is that she like is just like trying not to like tell them unnecessary things because at each stage she doesn't think it's going to escalate as much as it does.
yeah,
Um,
I can get behind that reading.
yeah.
Um, the other thing I meant with like wiki shit though was like all the stuff about the root and
Yeah, and that's what I was talking about when I was saying that like I don't really like what they did with the exposition. Like it could have been a
yeah,
lot more concise and like tight,
yeah,
for sure. Um, yeah, and the other thing after like of course is the scene after when he's already fallen and she's like, oh, like or we've already talking about okay, yeah, this is what we were talking about when we were talking about the climax the first time is when she's like, oh, like Araya, like what do you wish for? When he's like lying there dead. Um,
yeah,
and then he disappears. There's the weird line when he's like, when you're like that, you look like a girl of your age. It's like, I understand like the
yeah.
line. like it's the tone is a little different than what it's translated as. Like, it's but it's still weird. Like, it's still a little just like creepy and like not misogynistic necessarily, but it's like, come on, why? Like, there's no need for this.
Yeah.
Like, it's just it's out of place, right? Like, there definitely is
Right.
an element of Shiki's character where it's like, oh, like femme fatale, like, oh wow, can't believe something so beautiful is also something so
I don't
deadly.
know if it's just an element based on FGO, but hey.
Well, as far as this series goes, the most charitable reading of it is that it's like a superficial part of it, and it's not like the
Yeah.
whole motivation for
Yeah.
the character. But absolutely, in terms of her, like, yeah, I mean, how she's represented in ancillary media, yeah, I would
Well,
agree
not
that
even
it's pretty much the
represented. I think
entire
how
appeal
she's
of the character.
conceived mostly, or perceived mostly.
Yeah, yeah, no, I totally 100%.
Like, obviously perception and ancillary like influences perception, but
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think that fits together with in the rest of the movie is the commentary on which Shiki is the one that survived. Where it's like, Azaka is like, oh, is she a boy or a girl? Which is also where the movie has some casual homophobia, although it's not necessarily on the part of the narrative so much as the characters, so it's pretty
yeah.
forgivable. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
I
and
mean, it's
especially
also an old
Ayaka.
movie,
Yeah,
all things
like if it
considered.
was Kokuto, it'd be like, okay, huh? But
Yeah,
it
but
being
when it's Azaka,
Ayaka
it's like, oh,
is
she's jealous, like, whatever.
yeah.
you know?
Did I
Like,
say
she's gonna
Asuka
say
or
weird
Ayaka?
shit. I think you said Ayaka, but it's Azaka, yeah.
I meant Asuka, yeah.
But yeah, like, the only thing I can see that line fitting in with
Azaza.
is that discussion where it's like, all right, like, I don't necessarily see what they're trying to do here. Like, there's not really, like, a complete, like,
Yeah.
thesis or, like, arc or, like, I don't know, like, even just,
Maybe he was trying to be like, Nasu was trying to be like, oh, like, how Soren's like a couple hundred years old, like, you know, he's like, oh, you look like one of you youngsters. I don't know.
I don't think that would be the case.
Yeah. Hey, I'm trying to help Nasu out, okay? I don't know why, but
Yeah,
trying to give him a little benefit of the doubt.
yeah. I'm just trying to figure out, like,
Because
even
it
if
really
even
does
if we
feel
take
so out of place.
yeah, even if we take it as being connected with those other scenes, like,
It doesn't really work. Like
yeah,
it
like
doesn't
what's
connect
being done
in a way
here?
that makes sense. Like
What's the
it's
objective?
like connecting the dots, but you're missing three dots in between.
Yeah,
Anyways, Nasu has moments.
yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I can't think. I don't know if I have that much more to add, but no, like I've never really had that much to add from the start. So
Yeah. And then I guess the other thread going through the whole movie is like the keys, like the after credit scene,
well,
right? Where
I
where
mean it's
he comes
yeah. I
in.
like I think
Well,
it's
actually,
like
that no, that's
keys
just
and
the end of the movie.
doorknobs. Keys and doorknobs is
Well,
kind of
okay.
a motif
I mean,
running
yeah,
through the whole
that's more
thing.
of a motif than a theme. But yeah, like, I actually
But
I like the way
it's a
the movie
motif
ends. I
used
was
to drive home a theme, even if it's not a super explicit
yeah,
theme.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, I mean, we're on the same page. I just
yeah.
anyway, yeah, I was just thinking, like, chronologically, I was thinking, like, okay, and then what comes after the scene that we were just talking about where he's, like, on the ground dying? And yeah, the end of, like, the notable thing is the end of the movie where Shiki is in her bed and, like, Kokuto, like, rings the doorbell and then he unlocks the door and comes in. Um, I actually like the end of the movie. And, like, I think that
I
that's
like it too.
one sense in which, like, the way that they display scenes works, because we've seen that scene before and it didn't have context until now, right? I think that works, right? You know, it's a little hard to disentangle from everything that's happening in the second act, right? Because it's like, can you have, like, that scene being displaced while, like, not having all the rest of the, like, craziness without it feeling weird? And I think the answer is yes, right? But maybe it wouldn't be as like, interesting if that was the only thing that was displaced, because you'd just be like, oh, okay, like, what's that? And then later you're like, oh, it was that, okay. I think that would be fine. Yeah, I think it would work. But yeah, I like it. And then yeah, like the after credit scene is just the continuation of that, right? Where he comes in and they trade keys, and she's like, we both got to have keys to each other's apartments, and it's like, oh, I see. So that's what this movie was. Um,
Yep.
and like obviously there's more going on in the movie, but I jokingly said that like, oh, so the whole conception of this movie was, all right, we need to progress their relationship. They need to have keys to each other's apartments. Quick, make a movie about keys. You gotta have
Yeah.
themes about protecting your house and family and your daily life with keys to your doors. Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Kara no Kyoukai says, dense housing, bad, suburbs good.
I yeah, it's about as black and white as the movies ever get.
Yeah, I mean, there is quite a lot in this movie that is indicative of a dissatisfaction with a certain kind of housing. It's hard to say necessarily what it's specifically referring to. I'm passingly familiar with different types of public housing in Japan. Um, I don't. There's no immediately obvious connection for me here. But like the whole design of the building is very clearly inspired by something, right? It's similar. It's similar to the first movie.
Something.
Well, I
Sorry.
really do mean something because it's like
Yeah, no, I know. I'm
anybody
clown.
with a brain can be like, oh, it's based on confusing apartment buildings, but I mean like referring to like a very specific type. Like I'm talking like if we're, like specific government programs, like specific buildings that like you could like go to the library and like look up like people who have written books about the history of housing in Japan. Like, I'm talking about that level of connection. That doesn't appear to me immediately. In the same way that it doesn't for the first movie, and this is something that I don't think I mentioned when we were talking about the first movie, but they also have similar architectural commentary in the first movie where they talk about the Fujio building. I say that it's similar. There's much less of it, but it's on kind of the same level where they say something about it that's like, okay, sure, but I don't really know what you're talking about. Right?
Yeah,
Where
like
they're
they
like,
say something about it, and they're like, and therefore,
yeah, and in the
like
first
more
movie
people
it's a
want to
little
die
bit less
there.
architectural in nature. It's more just
Yeah,
about
certainly.
abandoned buildings generally.
Yeah.
But clearly it is like high-rise housing that is like,
Well, and I remember, wasn't it like the Fujo landlord like has like some history, like the Fujo Kiria's dad like had some history, and that's why it was abandoned or something.
uh,
Like he like committed crime or like fraud or
I no,
something.
I don't
I don't
believe
know.
so. No,
Oh,
they
okay.
just
Never
they just
mind.
weren't maintained. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah, like I don't know if there's
Anyways,
like a specific like movement that's referring to either. Like that's the kind of thing that like a historian would be better suited to say, right? And it may be that is like a cultural reference that's more salient to Japanese people, or at least people with like similar life experiences as Nasu. Because I would have to
yeah. If
imagine
there's
that
any,
that kind of stuff is something that he's drawing on, right? Like he's
yeah.
not just like making shit up where he's like, oh, how about let's have it take place in an apartment building, and let's also throw in all this architectural commentary about how the way that the building is shaped and the fact that you're like a certain number of floors up makes it like hard to necessarily tell exactly what's going on, and it like distorts your sense of reality, and like like all the only thing that like is anchoring you is like a couple of letters in the lobby. It's like, okay, like this is coming from somewhere, right?
Yeah. If there's anyone out there who grew up in Japan in the 80s, 90s, like in lived in multiple public housing complexes, listening to this podcast right now, I don't know why you would be, but uh, let us know. We'd love to know.
Yeah, or if you're just a historian of like
Yeah, or
urban
if you know
planning
about, yeah,
in Japan. Um,
because it really does seem like a very
yeah, it's
like
like oddly specific.
yeah specific in a
Um,
very concrete way.
like there's two possibilities, right? Like either it's a thing that like you could look up and find that like a historian would know about, where it's like a particular kind of housing that all kind of was maintained this way or all had this kind of psychological effect, or it's just like a specific thing that Natsu had an experience with that like left an impression on him that like no one else can really know what it specifically was.
Yeah, if Nasu, if you're listening to this right now, let us know.
Yeah,
Give us
Natsu
a
in the
shout.
comments. Yeah, like there's clear message. There's a clear message there, and that's something that I wouldn't say that I didn't pick up on it, but like I didn't see it as big of a part of the movie as I do now, which is just like the whole, you know, It's all just set up for making them exchanging keys being like meaningful. Like
Yeah.
they spend the whole movie being like this key is so important, and like Enjo has this whole like breakdown, and he's like I should have protected my daily life, and it's like this key, you know, like my home and my daily life were so valuable. So that at the end of the movie when they exchange keys, we're like, oh man, that is really important.
Yeah, I will say I do think it's a really good decision the way that they,
Yeah,
isolated.
I'm just joking around.
Oh no, well I'm talking about like, how the first act, like this is kind of obvious I guess, but the first act like, is Shiki's act, and Kokuto is just never present. Like you never see him. And then
No,
the
you see
second
him.
act
He's sitting on the
is
bench.
okay. Well,
Yeah, it's a joke. Continue.
they never Shiki and Kokuto never come into contact. Like you never see them, right? Um, Together. And then like the second act, um, is Kokuto's act, and like the one time that like, or whenever Kokuto and Shiki are talking, like, you don't see Shiki, like,
Yeah, they're never in the shot together. Actually, she's never in the
yeah,
shots at all.
yeah,
Yeah,
she's just not in any shot exactly. Like you hear her
yeah.
voice, but like she's just off screen always. I liked, the way I liked that idea in the context of, the after credit scene. Um, where it's like, hey, like, they've been apart and now they can be together. It's pretty simplistic, I guess, but
Yeah, well, I mean, we've said this before, but subtlety is really overrated. Like, get your
really
message
overrated.
across first,
Definitely
and then
overrated.
work on it being subtle. It's way more important to have something to say than to say it in a way that's subtle.
Nah, I vote just don't say anything per se.
Yeah.
Just be safe.
Well, and the other alternative is it being incomprehensible, which is worse in its own way. I guess it's better than not having anything to say, but yeah, subtlety overrated. Please do things as straightforwardly as possible.
Well, think about being straightforward first.
Yeah.
If you figured that shit out, then you can think about making things more subtle. Like have a straightforward. I don't know. I abort. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we're in agreement on that point. Um,
Yeah, I'm just. It doesn't feel like there's any need to go into that
yeah,
on this
I know
episode.
writers who use subtlety, and they're all cowards. Yeah.
They're
Anything
all.
else about the movie? I don't know. Like,
Uh, um,
oh, we
it's
didn't talk
long.
about the animation cuts. Like there's a couple of
Oh
different
yeah. Well, we
fights, and
talked
they all
about
have
that. Yeah.
yeah. The first act has surprisingly like kind of the best animation of the bunch, I think. Not
Well,
only the
yeah. The
chase
first. I
scene,
mean,
but
the first
also when
fight.
Shiki beats up
Yeah.
the dudes. Like
Yeah.
it's
The
really
chase
clean,
scene
it's
and the fight.
dynamic, it's expressive. Like
Yeah. The chase scene and the fight feels like the money shot for the movie. That's like, make sure that people don't leave their seats. Um,
yeah, well, yeah,
and then
yeah,
once
to a
once you're
degree.
stuck in your seat, once you've sunk 20, 30 minutes into the movie and it's become a sunk cost, um, then they can hit you with the spinny spin.
Yeah, yeah. So the fight in the latter, or actually I guess right at the end of the first act, where Shiki kills all the well kills, I guess, I don't know, all the puppets. It's markedly not as good in quality. So
As the
it's
very
fluid
first
and
fight.
dynamic, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's expressive, or at the very least it's kind of discordant with the tone of the scene. And in particular, there's a one shot that like we
Yeah.
literally while we were watching, we like looked over at each other like, is this happening? Where
We we
they
we looked
literally
we looked over to each other like laughing, like
yeah,
out
yeah,
laughing
like
out loud, like
and I said it's like straight out of a silent movie, like legit. Like what was the like what were you referring
um
to, John, that you said?
wait, back then you mean?
If you make a reference to film history, it makes us seem more credible.
Oh, I was talking about the Keystone Cops and like Buster Keaton movies where, someone like flies out of a and then, like you just do the same shot, like you just repeat it.
Yeah.
Like ah, ah, is I think how I specifically conveyed it.
Yeah, so they did that shot, and specifically like what in this movie what happens is Shiki kicks like a puppet over the balcony, and it cuts to a shot, like a wide shot from outside the building, seeing them fall, and then the exact same thing happens two more times. And it just really that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
So like
And
that's
they
not the
almost
animation, right?
like
That's the direction. The direction is also kind of
yeah.
discordant with the tone, and maybe it's the
That's
music then, because like the direction and the animation are almost kind of in agreement as far as the tone, which is to say that it's comedic. And whereas the music is like intense, and like the tone, at least of the surrounding scenes, is also quite intense.
yeah, although I will say, like, compared definitely to the other four, there's a noticeable lack of like um stereotypical Kajiura Yuki like
That's true.
for the first two acts. It seems like an intentional decision. Um, I believe like the first one that I noticed with like Kajiura Yuki, like, you know, choral, like, you know what I'm talking about, was when Shiki comes out of the elevator in Act Three.
Yeah, yeah.
That
And
was
no,
the
you're
first time I
absolutely
noticed
right.
it.
The music in the first two acts is like
It's tame
it.
almost.
I don't even know that I would say that it's tame,
Well,
because like
it's
there's
like it's tamed
the
Kajiura Yuki.
instrumentation
Like
is rather different. It's well, but like
yeah,
I don't even I like again I don't know that I would say that it's tamed,
yeah,
because
tame
it's
is not
more
the right word.
energetic and kind of
Yeah,
all over the place and discordant, although not in the same way that the tone is discordant, right? Like it, like that the piece that plays during the scene that we're talking about, where she kills the puppets, is like the piano that's like like
you know, it's like two octaves lower, but yeah,
yeah, well, I mean, I can't go 2 octaves lower, so
I'm aware. It you know it very much feels like comedy scoring.
a little bit.
Like if you were trying
Yeah,
to like
it's not
score
quite
a
there though.
fight in a comedy, yeah, I agree that
Yeah,
it's not quite there, but like the vibe and the tone is there, and that's just
yeah.
what
Anyway,
works
that
well.
action scene is weird. And her fight with Soren is all right, but then the scene where he heals is also kind of comedic. Um,
Yeah,
like the uh, I don't know that I've mentioned this yet, but one of the first things I said when we had just finished watching the movie is that it's like a surprisingly, like, I hadn't picked up on this. It's actually quite a funny movie. Um, like when Enjo is like watching Araya like heal from being stabbed in the neck, and like his head
they're
just like
both
whips
just like
around like
yeah,
like
like
there's
one of the first shots at the start, or first cuts at the start of the movie, like Enjo is sitting there like just like pulsating back and forth, and then it flips up, and or you know it cuts, and Araya is like his neck is just like like just like flipping back and forth.
yeah, like it almost seems like they're accidentally walking the line between comedy and horror, right? Because it's definitely
Yeah.
supposed to be like weird in an unsettling way, but it ends up being weird in a comedic way depending on like what mood you're in, I guess.
Well,
Like if
and
you're
also
really willing
depending
to
on
take it
how much
seriously, I'm sure
anime
that you can.
you've seen, I
Yeah,
feel like,
yeah.
because like it feels like it's trying to be like that kind of like unnatural, like the
Oh, of
vertebrae in
course.
his neck are like bending in unnatural ways, and like, but it's just him headbanging basically.
Yeah, like it definitely depends on
Just
how
a,
much
a
the audience
weird.
is like willing to forgive it, right? Because like if the audience is really invested, then like they'll see it as what it's supposed to be, right? Like they'll be like, oh yeah, like that's unnatural in a horrifying way. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
there's something distinctly funny about a lot of the things in this movie that really it doesn't feel like they should be. But again, something that I said before when we were talking, not recording, I think it actually benefits from the humor. Like the first act especially, because Tomoe, Enjo Tomoe, like the guy is just funny. Like he's not a
Yeah.
comedian or anything, right? But like he's such a like normal, pathetic guy compared to the other characters in this series. And that's the point, right? The point is that he's a normal guy in a group of weirdos, but it every like almost all of his lines are just like hilariously like normal. Like he has like such a like I keep using the word pathetic, but it's almost like base. Like
Yeah.
when he's just like, I'm in love with you, I want to die for you, and you're just like, man, bruh. Like it's hard to take him seriously, and it's like, because like the thing is, when he's like, I'm in love with you, Shiki, like it's not really supposed to be a funny scene, but it is, because he's so ridiculous, you know. And like when he's and the scene, so I think part of the reason is like they also include scenes where he's like, oh, like I'm a guy, like you're really gonna let me over, it means that, and she's just like, yeah, okay, like she's just not having it. Like that scene's like really funny, And I don't think it's supposed to be laugh out loud funny. I think it's supposed to just be that like he's kind of like, you know, ah ha ha ha, like the dumb innocent boy, teenage boy, versus, you know, the the Chad I don't care ski, right? Like yeah, like it's supposed to. I think with that scene, like it's supposed to be kind of humanizing for him. It's supposed to like sort of drive home that he's like a little like innocent and like not dumb, but like, you know, he's sort of a relatably clumsy dude. But it ends up being really funny, and then that sort of like sets the stage for other scenes that are supposed to be more serious, also being funny. Um, but surprisingly, I really do think that it makes the movie more enjoyable, because otherwise the first act is really just kind of a like a plod along,
Yeah.
a bit of a not a drag. What's the term? Oh well, yeah. It drags on without the humor. So
Yeah. I in particular remember the Papa Point pencil.
oh yeah, oh my god, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Pencil.
That dude, that scene was so like randomly hilarious. Like they stopped the music and everything. She just turns
Yeah,
around
they
with like a
stopped the
shocked
scene.
look on her face. Yeah, like it literally just the movie is like,
Like
yeah, we're just
Nasu was
gonna
like,
we
Nasu was
interrupt
like,
your
I'm just gonna
regularly
break.
scheduled programming to talk about this like thing that's I'm nostalgic about.
And then you're like, okay, they did it really quick. Now they're walking out of the building. She's like, you really don't know what it is. And they're like, no, I'm still doing it.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah, the movie is weirdly funny. Hmm?
I don't. I'm trying to like. I don't. Is Papa Point just like a mechanical pencil?
I think maybe. I'm Googling it right now.
Yeah. Oh, wait. It's a series of lead points in the barrel of. So instead of like a lead that you insert and then slowly like use more of,
I
it's
see.
like a small point and you use up the point and then you just swap in another one.
Yeah.
Different
Okay.
designs.
Yeah, I mean that like it's really like that came out of left field. Even having seen
Yeah.
this movie a couple times before, I totally forgot that they did that. It's incredible. Like they actually just stop the movie and are like, you know, we're
Gotta
doing
have
this
our
now.
comedic relief, you know. The
Yeah.
rest of the movie isn't funny enough already.
I mean, if anything, that makes me think that
Obviously
maybe the
they don't
comedy
think.
in the first act is intentional. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think this movie. I guess we should. We've already talked about the fight in the climax, right? So we've sort of gone through all the animation that's like of note now. Um, so yeah, in terms of overall, I would say this movie, like, you know, problematic fave isn't the right word, but like, you know, it's a movie that I like despite its flaws. Despite not liking it very much, I can appreciate it a lot just because it's like there's so much
Yeah.
weirdness. Like it has a lot going for it despite doing a lot of things very poorly.
And like
And
we talk about how they take just too many risks, and they do take too many risks, but also like taking too many risks is infinitely better than taking no risks, right?
yeah, yeah, not
Um,
necessarily for creating an
well,
enjoyable movie, but for creating an interesting movie that you can talk
exactly.
about and think about. Like,
Like
yeah, absolutely.
I think the two of us certainly like don't really care about enjoyability anymore.
Oh, I care a lot
Just
about
take
enjoyability.
well, okay. But like for me, like some like I'd rather have something interesting, right?
Mm. Yeah, for me, I don't really know. I think they would be equally like. For me, the way that it is like it's got to be enjoyable, or I'm not even getting in the door to the interesting, right?
Okay.
Which is how I think it works for most people. Like maybe a little bit less for me, right? But I definitely would say like, you know, in a moral sense, like what should you create? Like, oh, I don't know, right? But
Yeah, okay.
practically, what I end up liking is always the enjoyable before the interesting. And then
Okay.
what I like
That's
out of
fair.
those is what's both, right? But there's very few things that I like that are like interesting but not enjoyable. And I think
Yeah.
that this movie falls into that category. Like I don't know that I would ever like really like get obsessed about this movie. I don't know that I would ever really like gush about it or anything. But like yeah, I think you know with this recent watch I've come to a new appreciation for it. I think especially like the biggest thing that makes me really think like wow, you know, maybe I actually kind of like this movie is the humor because it's just like it's so silly weirdly. And I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like for me, like enjoyability is secondary. to, it's not irrelevant, but it's secondary to interesting, which is probably the reason that I've completed like 500 different things on my anime list.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm much more willing to drop things than you are.
Yeah, it's like the reason I completed Decadence, you know? Like, it's like, there's interesting ideas that they might explore, and then we get to the end, and it's like, yeah. But like, Decadence isn't relevant, but like, I didn't enjoy Decadence necessarily. Like, that wasn't why I kept watching it. Anyways, I feel like, I mean, cut that last part out, but.
Well, I think we've spiraled around long enough around this conclusion. How many times is
Yeah.
it now that we've said, it's like that thing where they show the same shot like three different times. This is like the third or fourth time that we've said that we're about to end. But this time it's for real.
I mean, we just have to keep spiraling down.
Yeah, see, it's like a spiral in that it
If it
spirals.
ended, it would be a
Like
paradox.
it goes around and around, except and get this, it's actually a paradox. So like not only does it go around, like it's